the term we use is avaz suno, listen to the voice. And we need to listen to the voices of our past and put a layer of truth telling to those voices so that we look at the reality of those voices and celebrate them rather than sweeping them under the carpet.
Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society podcast. Have you ever come across something and thought, I'm not smart enough for this? We think the fault lies with those who present information in ways which are hard to understand. In an attempt to change this, we'll be speaking to researchers, experts, and all-round wrinkly-brained individuals, improving our understanding of a broad range of topics which are rooted in psychology. Join us as we try to develop ourselves one brain fold at a time.
Please note that the Smooth Brain Society podcast is distinct from the Herenga Waka Victoria University of Wellington. The views expressed on this show are those of our guests, presenters, and affiliates alone, and we assume no liability for the application of the information discussed. We also take no responsibility for any change in brain folds on part of the audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Now on to the podcast. All right, welcome back to the Smooth Brain Society. I am Sahir, and today with me I have Dr. Richard Johnson, a senior lecturer academic at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, Melbourne, Australia. And he was over in New Zealand visiting his grandsons, one of whom is co-hosting with me today and is seated on my right, Finn Johnson.
Hey guys, how's it going?
I will let Finn introduce himself a little bit. Apart from being the grandson of this great man, what else do you do?
Kia ora everyone. As Sahir said, my name is Finn. I'm a PhD student here in the School of Psychology. I whakapapa up to Mahia and Hitatonga through Ngāti Kahununu and Urungamai Wahine. I'm also a student of clinical psychology, and my kaupapa that I research is Māori wellbeing. Stoked to be here today.
Awesome. And welcome to you too, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Sai. It's just a real privilege to be part of this podcast. I think any notion of a smooth brain has hooked me in completely. So when I listened to your podcast, I thought it was just fascinating. So, to find a little entry in something of which I can share some of my interests at this stage would be just wonderful.
Should we just start off there then? Could you give us a little bit of background into your...
Yeah. As it happens, as you said, I'm visiting my grandsons, Finley and Lewis. And it's actually, I have to say, it's happened by accident. So maybe that fits into the smooth brain kind of stuff because it all kind of fits together, doesn't it? And I come to New Zealand and I find myself at an intersection between two cultures almost. So one is the Maori culture, and and I don't pretend to have any expertise in it. However, in just these 2 short weeks, I've had a wonderful introduction into Maori culture through my both grandsons. And I've come, so that's one area. I've come from Melbourne with an interest in Anglo-Indian culture. So I'm an Anglo-Indian. And in case you're saying, what is an Anglo-Indian? An Anglo-Indian is a person of mixed race. Anglo-Saxon, let's say British, European, that background, and Indian. So I went to Australia in 1969 from India. I've spent the first 23 years of my life in India, went to Australia, and I identify as ethnically an Anglo-Indian. Of course, now, I hold an Australian passport. I am Australian. I barrack for the Australian cricket team, so that makes me Australian, doesn't it? So, but my ethnicity, I am still ethnically an Anglo-Indian. And recently, and it is recently, I reflected on my Anglo-Indian background So I call it the hyphenated background because Anglo-Indian. And I've been using this term hyphenated for a while. And then I suddenly realized, the hyphen is not really a horizontal hyphen. The hyphen, as I perceive it in 1922, is kind of quite tilted in favor of the Anglo and with a whole lot of gaps in the Indian. So I was brought up listening to a lot of stories from my grandmother in Calcutta. And my grandmother told me a lot about stories about her grandfather. And he was a Scottish Glende, his surname was. And him coming to India and a lot of stories about Scottish background. And then I did a DNA test. And I find that I've got 1% Scottish DNA. I've got 80% Indian DNA. And there are other odds and sods, like 9% British and 1% this and that and the other. But what interests me is that I've got 80% Indian DNA, and that is not reflected in the way my life has been conducted to this day. So I reckon I've been brought up as, a little white person. And of course, I'm not a little white person. In fact, this is a podcast, so but people who have vision here would see that I look as Indian as they come, so to speak. However, whatever one want to categorize, my complexion is a dark complexion and Indian complexion. But none of the stories that I heard had any Indian surname connected to them. Now that's curious. Then I come to this, and here's the intersection. I come to the Maori culture, and I find from my grandsons especially, that the Maori, a cornerstone of the Maori culture, as I understand it, is this notion of whānau, this notion of family, and this notion of connections, and this idea that all these dots are connected. The birds, the trees, the natural phenomena, the human. Your relatives are just so important. And bingo, the intersection is now rich. It's rich because I think that's something I've got to work on. That's something I've got to go back to and do some more solid research on to find out the Indian in me. And that's the name of our project, The Indian in Me. So we are a group of people who are really looking at researching who is the Indian connection in their Anglo-Indian combination of an ethnicity. So does that give you an idea of that intersection that I referred to?
Yeah, that kind of idea of you genetically, you biologically being from somewhere or majority being from somewhere, but that not really reflecting in your history through various reasons. That's very interesting. It feels like almost like a washing off a certain part of who you are or what you might have been if you had that information growing up.
Yes, exactly. And while some might see it as me blaming my past and saying I should have or I could have, I don't think that way. I'm quite happy to accept that growing up, my grandmother told me the stories that she perceived as important. And that's what I got. Whereas now I'm at the point of looking at those perceptions and looking at them critically and saying, why was there a sweeping under the carpet of the Indian side of that? So there you are, Finn. What do you think, Finn?
I was just going to ask you, a really interesting corridor right there. And I was wondering how your project, The Indian in Me, relates to the idea of decolonization. I know that you've recently been reading Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Smith, and I was wondering how that kind of relates for you.
Oh, there, I have got to take it one at a time, Finn, because you're spot on. Um, the point about decolonization, and then the literature that you're referring to. So the first one, I mean, it's spot on. I mean, the Indian in me is in very much a sense of talking about decolonizing and decolonization and the thinking, because one needs to address what colonization is. And in my perception of this project, it's about the East India Company, you know, going to India to do business, taking over the whole business, the whole box and dice, and then the British government finding their feet in India, and and coming to the point where today, it's actually a very hard difference to make about what were the contributions of the British in India. And there's some good current literature to suggest that the contribution needs to be looked at very critically, the British contribution, because the current literature is suggesting that the East India Company was just looting Indian wealth. And there's no question about that to some extent. But the British, of course, when we talk about colonization, did the presence in India with such aplomb, like they do everything in a sense. It was dressed up so beautifully that they were there to help. They were there to take civilization to India. I mean, it's almost laughable because when we talk about civilization in India, I mean, India goes back, well precedes British entry there. So when we address this decolonization, we look at some of this literature and we look at some of these events. We're looking at our everyday life. I'm not, in one sense, I'm not looking at the literature. I'm looking at my own life, and I'm looking in and saying, where's the Indian in me? Who took that away? Why am I not as aware of that as I am of the Anglo? And the voice in the background is telling me that's because of colonization. We almost regard the colonization taking place and put them on a pedestal. So we look up to the colonizer, and now a lot of questions are being asked in India, I believe. And certainly I'm asking within myself and trying to look at this equation of the Anglo-Indian in me and doing some research on the Indian side of that to give that eliminated voice. So I have done, looking back at my genealogy, and on one side, I've got a lot more research to do, but on one side, I have come to the East India Company man who came to Australia, came to India as a soldier in the army, and then because of an injury left the service and had a relationship with an Indian woman who bore him a child. And of course, her name was given to her as Mary. So her Indian name is not recorded because she had to convert to Anglicanism or Catholicism in order to marry him. And creating this little British gentleman called Richard Johnson, who's certainly not British, and the person who suddenly finds himself being brought up. My first language is English. Culturally, I was really not a part. I mean, I'm not a part of the Indian caste system, for example. I'm a Catholic. So there are all these separations in a sense. It is no wonder that I left India and came to Australia. you see. So now my research takes on an even more difficult turn because that's the end of her credentials, her documentation. So now I have to actually get back to research on the ground and go back to church documents and see who this Mary was, what was her Indian name, and give voice to that character that was otherwise silenced. Now that's happened a few times in my genealogy, and I'll be researching that. So there's a lot of work to be done, interesting work to be done, and very positive work to be done. There's no criticism here of any individual or the community, the Anglo-Indian community. I mean, I'm very, dare I say, proud to be Anglo-Indian. I don't know what proud to, but I am Anglo-Indian. So, you are what you are, and I am Anglo-Indian. And that was, I'm totally accepting.
Well, so far you spoke about just yourself in your journey. Now the project obviously encapsulates a wider group of people, the entire community. Have they faced similar difficulties, or is it every Anglo-Indian story very different?
Yeah, thank you, Zaya. That's a great question because that opens it up to a wider community. And yes, I also have to reflect on a number of Anglo-Indians who are living in India, still living in India. And in the 50 years that I've been away, things have changed. And those people there listening to this podcast would say, hey, Richard, your story is different. My story, that is their story, currently, Richard Johnson in 2022, living in India, never having left, will have maybe an Indian wife. Whereas the Richard Johnson in that era, my era, tended to marry an Anglo-Indian, as I did. I am working with a group of people, 8, 10 people. They are from the same generation, but they have had similar experiences. What we're doing is we are looking at producing a film, and we are very well advanced into the writing of the script that depicts this union that took place of this British East India Company person and the Indian woman, and the Indian woman's voice that was silenced as her children were taken away and became Anglo-Indians in a sense. And her identity with her Indian name was lost to the British name, similar to the Richard Johnson. And so it went. So yes, this is shared by a number of people, but we will include the current Anglo-Indians who are living in India, who have not had the same experience because they have intermarried with the Indian community and have had a closer communication with the Indian community. So this is a shared identity issue and question, but we will be inclusive of all the stories of the Anglo-Indians.
I was wondering if you could touch on a little bit more about what it was like kind of growing up as an Anglo-Indian and what some of those differences were. Because I've, growing up, heard stories from you and my grandmother about how, you almost looked down upon, or your grandparents were offended if you spoke to them in Hindi or any other language that's not English. So I was wondering if you could please touch upon that.
Yeah, terrific question. Because I grew up in an environment where you spoke English. You sat at a table on a chair and ate your meals with a spoon and fork. And even the meals that you ate were English, and then they were Anglo-Indian too, because they were modifications, of the English diet to make it Anglo-Indian. But you see, I grew up when if I was thinking about myself as a very young child. I mean, I couldn't play with the street kids like the chokras we used to go, out in the streets. They'd play with no shoes on and kick footballs and so on. Whereas my gentle little feet had to be protected in beautiful little shoes, and shorts, and I had to come home clean. And I used to envy those little guys, running around with no shoes and socks and could roll in the dust and not be. So yes, there was a an air of being, dare I say, better. Certainly better provided for in a different way.
It almost feels like kind of posher
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of identity.
yeah, and a distancing identity. So I'm not one of you. I've got to have a different name. So someone would say, Richard, what a funny name that is. I don't have any people in mind. I have Ranjit and Ashok. Richard, where do you get that name from? Well, that's an Anglo-Indian. See, I'm putting my chin up and saying, because,
Some strange sense of superiority.
a strange sense of superiority. But it wasn't strange then. It was totally normal then. And it's strange now, because, superiority? It's almost laughable now. But now it's an old man speaking.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what was that journey of like realization almost like? Because I guess you said that it was normal back then, but now thinking back, it feels very strange. How was that journey?
That I think that journey was normalized as long as I was in India. I think coming to Australia was when I came to Australia, I learned more about India than when I was in India. So when I came to Australia, I was 23. I did a degree in Melbourne University. In fact, I even did a degree in Indian Studies at Melbourne University. That was fabulous because I learned about Indian music. I learned about Indian art. I learned a lot about India. And the other thing was I was seen by friends and people around me. I was seen not as an Anglo-Indian, I was seen as an Indian. Because, who's an Anglo-Indian? And you just say, I'm from India. Yeah? And in 1969, there were very few Indians in Australia. And now, by the way, the census that just came out a few months ago shows that the Indian population in Melbourne has grown now to be the largest population are people who are British from first parents born in England, British people, and then Indians. So they've gone up the ladder to be. So now, of course, every 7-Eleven shop is, you go there, you find Indians behind the counter. Thank God, the Indian sweets you can buy, magnificent Indian sweets. And as a person from Bengal, Bengal Sandesh, oh my gosh, Indian sweets. So I've got this taste for Indian food and Indian sweets, and you can now get the best in I was going to say best in Melbourne, but I'm not trying to say it's better than Wellington because the Indian
Probably
food
is,
shops
not gonna say.
everywhere here too. Yeah.
Well, that speaks more to like globalization in general.
Yes.
But it does raise the wider idea of identity, and I can ask Finn about this as well, as someone who grew up in Australia and is now doing research with in the Maori community. How has that been?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Sahid. And I think that, reflecting back over the years, when I look back, growing up in Australia, I didn't actually know who I was, and especially as a young kid. As Pa said, we're growing up over there with our Anglo-Indian whānau. My mum, is from New Zealand, and so we had that whole side of the family that we didn't grow up around. And so we grew up around my dad and Pa and all that side of the Anglo-Indians. And so growing up, we had Indian food, which was cool, but we didn't actually have many other aspects of the culture very salient. And so growing up, I identified as Australian, thought I was a little Aussie, and always knew deep down that, we had this Māori side that we just didn't know much about. And that wasn't until we as a whānau moved over to New Zealand in 2010 that my brother and I were really able to get stuck in and connect with our whakapapa Māori And that was truly, transformational in our lives, as we were able to really ground ourselves in something, and really reach down and make those connections, which has been really amazing. And we've been able to draw a lot of strength from that connection, and we've really just loved our connection to Te Ao Māori, and are really having a good time with it. And it's a really important part of who we are. And so now, like 12 years later, and being more connected and rooted in our Māori culture, I reflect back now and I look at the, past talking about the Indian in me. I see some of those similarities between, with that whole colonization and how that's played out. And personally, I know Pa talks about himself identifying as Anglo-Indian. The colonizing side in front of me kind of makes me want to just identify as Indian. I'm Maori and I'm Indian. Of course, I've got that that ancestry to England and these other places, but I personally just try to stay away from the Anglo-Indian, because I just feel like you said, those people came over, they silenced those voices, and I think it's a really interesting conversation.
So, Zahir, if following on from what Finn is saying, I think the inspiration of the Maori, in my thinking, is this notion of connection and family connection. And that's something that is my big takeaway from this visit. And that will certainly enrich our research. Because what it points to is the need for one to look back at their history, their family history, and look for making connections. Now, some people, immediately say, "Oh, that's really a bit hurtful or a bit dangerous or whatever," because they've got skeletons in the cupboard and they don't want that kind of thing released. But really, we're not about skeletons in the cupboard. We're about a positive view of looking at your past and making links, so that when you are presented with a DNA map, for example, you have a better and a more realistic way of connecting stories with those different connections of people. I would love to have come away what do I mean by that? Come away from my younger days with a lot more stories about the Indian people in my genealogy. So I think there's a lot of scope for us to do a lot of connections there. But I would still come back to the Maori inspiration of connectivity and, in a sense, truth telling. Because we are looking at the real,
Like
who
the
am
whole
I?
picture.
The whole
Yeah.
picture, and that's what I find quite useful and inspiring.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the research itself, and ask you, how do you go about conducting this on a wider scale? Because you said there's
Yeah.
9 of you who are doing it.
Yeah.
So the Indian in me, how does that
Yeah.
go?
Well, we've got, as I see it, 3 strands to the research. Okay? The first strand is one where I'm particularly interested in. Well, I'm interested in all 3, but the first one, I'm the one who's trying to recruit a bit of interest to it, and that is just simply looking at one's family tree and building it. So I look at some of the major databases like Ancestry.com, Find My Past, My Heritage, and actually look for the various layers of your family tree, and actually put the information in to a database that actually shows the family tree. Now, I'd love to be able to pictorially show that, but it's appropriate to actually draw out the family tree. Now, as one goes further and further on, you come to the point where you see the connection. You either stop and think, now where does this go? Because I can't go any further. And then the question is, why can't you go any further? Because of the data available on one side or both sides. So some people can go back and further back and further back. So that's one strand of the research project, actually putting those family trees together. And that's anyone who's involved in putting their family tree together will tell you that that's time consuming, and but it's very, very, very rewarding and interesting. Or maybe very rewarding and interesting.
Well, Dr. Hassan, who came on and spoke about genetics, talked about how for genetic counseling they do family trees for the reason of knowing where a certain disease came from. So
Yeah.
Same logic, but for a more social aspect, I guess.
Yes. And but this is the thing. I mean, when I heard that podcast, I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? Because the family tree can be used for other purposes too. So the first one is family tree. The second one is collecting stories, just straight out collecting stories. So I've got a round table online being conducted in November, where I've got 15 people. Actually, at the moment, I haven't got 15 people, but I'd like to have 15 people to tell their stories. And the stories must be about the Indian in me, the Indian in them, not in me, in them. So they'll tell their story about their Indian connection, okay, at whichever level. And, it'll be on Zoom. They'll have 10 minutes. They could cook an Indian meal and have this camera on them and talk while they're cooking the meal and talk about that story about the meal and the odor of the meal that takes their minds back home all those years ago. So you can use any method to think back, a piece of art. So, and they can talk about it. So the second strand is telling stories. We're collecting stories. And what will we do with that collection? Well, we could do several things. But at the moment, we're thinking about an illustrated book, not an academic book, an illustrated book, telling stories from the heart about connections. And our third strand is the film. So the film is fiction, however, fiction based on documented fact. So this William, the British East India Companyman in the late 1700s, it's based on a character. And he gets married in England, but he's not allowed, the East India Company does not allow him at his rank to take his wife to India. So he goes on his own. Now, you know what's going to happen. This blue-eyed, 6'3", attractive Englishman goes to India and leaves his wife in England. And so it does happen. He has a relationship with an Indian woman. Child is born, and so on and so forth. So what happens there is that woman that he has that relationship with I'm letting you into a little bit of the secret of the story, but she has twins. And one of the twins is very fair-skinned and one is dark-skinned. Now, that guy has to go back to England to his wife. She's unwell. But when he goes back, he falls ill and dies. And his money, his will, a part of his will, goes to India to his children. And his wife in England calls for the white child to be sent to England and send some money to India to look after the dark complexion child. Now, did we make that up? No, we didn't. That's an actual fact. Okay, so the wife lost one child, but who cares? She's just Mary anyway. Indian woman. We've even taken a name from her. Well, not only that, we've taken a child from her, and so that's the kind of documented plot that this fictional story has. So I've told you the three strands.
You've given a bit of the plot away, so anybody listening can be like really excited or not watch the movie because they've seen it now.
They must watch the movie because it is full of excitement. I mean, I haven't told you the gory bits and there's plenty of everything in it. If you ask me who is the main character in the film, it's that Indian woman who was silenced. Okay, so she gave birth to the child, and that was the end of Mary. That wasn't even her name. So that her presence is the ghost in the film that follows the film through three generations in India, starting in the late 1700s and finishing in around independence. And the voice, her voice, is a voice that has been silenced. And the ghost looks for a release of that voice. And so many can relate to this. So many different cross-cultural groups in what Finn mentioned before about colonization. So many other communities have been colonized in other parts of the world. And there have been these cross-cultural marriages in which a dominant culture, usually the colonizer, in this case the Anglo, has absolutely silenced the indigenous voice. And hopefully in this film, people will see parallels in the cross-cultural liaisons between the two communities. And what we've got is that ghost's voice that follows through the generations. The term we use is avaz suno, listen to the voice. And we need to listen to the voices of our past and put a layer of truth telling to those voices so that we look at the reality of those voices and celebrate them rather than sweeping them under the carpet.
Two things to that, what you just said. One is the idea of many cultures potentially relating to this, because as we know, different parts of Europe colonized different parts of the world, and the relationship is the same. So all of Latin America would associate with Spanish and Portuguese in the same way. It just happens so that because you're Anglo-Indian, you are enhancing these voices.
Yep. So there'll be French communities in Indonesia, for example. The Dutch who colonized, the French who colonized, the African colonization occurred. So yes, there are all those communities where these questions could be, and who could ask, and they could relate to this notion.
The second thing was you said awasuno, which means he listened to the sound, and every episode until this one, I used to start off with a quote in a language or a saying in a language to encapsulate the entire podcast. But this works perfectly because we're talking about Indonesians. So thank you for that.
Avaz suno.
This brings me to a point which I wanted to ask about, like, splitting up of families. As the plot of the story says, like, one sibling essentially leads another life past this point.
That's right.
And yeah, can you talk a bit about that, not just in Anglo-Indian culture, but in general? Maybe Finn, you can add to it, of like having that sort of disconnect and reconnecting with a certain part of a family which either you didn't know existed or you know exists but is some elsewhere.
Finn, do you want to go first and talk about that, or do you want?
I think that, like you just touched on, Sahid, like it's a really common narrative, and it was a really common process and practice that happened throughout colonization in different parts of the world. We know that there were so many like indigenous, like native boarding schools, like we've just heard recently about those ones in Canada, in which young kids were taken from their families and their parents, were brought up in these Anglo or settler ways and stuff, and were disconnected from their culture and were given away to white families. I know this happened really bad in Australia in particular. What the Aboriginal people went over there was horrific. And I think that was one way that they were able to, colonize, is to take those generations of children, disconnect them from their culture, show them these different ways, and disconnect them from their whakapapa, from their heritage. And so I think that point, and that those stories that you're talking about, Pa, in the film, will be able to connect to and resonate to a lot of different people. And it just, kind of goes to show that those colonial practices and stuff run deep and all around the world. It's really horrific, eh?
It's a terrific point that you touch on, Zahir, because that is the painful part of this dual identities or confused identities often. Because I don't know if people, let's say in Australia, white Australians, if they've actually thought about what it is like to leave India, where I was born, and then and come to Australia, and you suddenly find yourself in a completely, this white culture, and I'm seen as someone who's quite different. So there's that othering that occurs immediately. And how does that person really feel in that environment of being not from there? But there's a complexity there in that not from there issue. So when I was teaching, I would go into my tutorials often and tell students, especially the first tutorial, I'd say, "Hi, my name is Richard Johnson. I come from," I have to explain what Richard Johnson is because I don't look Richard Johnson, being of this Indian color that I am. So I'd explain, my migration story, 10, 15 minutes, that would be it. Okay? And then I'd turn to them and say, "Now, you tell me, let's go around, tell me your migration story." And they'd sit up and say, "I don't have a migration story." I said, "Oh, so you are indigenous?" "Oh, no, I'm not." Oh, no, So how did you get here? Did you swim here? Or walk? Or, tell us.
Even technically, that's also migration if you swim and get there.
That's right. But technically, they're quite indignant about the fact that this is my land. I said, no, hang on. When you go into a primary classroom, as you're going to as primary teachers, you've got to have that narrative that this country of Australia does not belong to us. Okay? We're here as visitors. That was
Guests on that stolen land.
Finn's voice speaking. So yes, we are visitors here. We need to appreciate being here and be part of that. So that identity issues is a very big one. Zahir, I don't know if you've seen The Nightingale. It's a Netflix film that I just watched yesterday. Wow, does it have a punch? The Nightingale. And it's an Australian early Tasmanian history setting. And it has a huge punch to it. And it really does look at a perspective of this story. A very important point, the point about separation.
So you've talked about, this research that you've done or that you're doing now. And I was wondering how that relates to the research you've previously done in your work over these, 50 years that you've been a lecturer.
Thanks, Finn. The previous research was, look, it's interesting. It's an interesting question because there was a lot of research in education and in teaching and in learning. But then there was also, and this is what makes it interesting in answering the question, there was also a lot of research on intercultural education. So I'm interested in, and I've done some research on international students studying in Australia. And my paper on the monsoon wedding phenomena was about the fact that as academics, we tended not to know enough about our international students. We need to spend a lot more time, I was arguing, understanding our international students, because we don't have any hesitation in taking their high fees. We should understand them much, much better. Because, one of the basics about teaching and learning is the teacher must understand the learner. Well, understand their cultural background too. They're not all just Indians or Indonesians or Chinese. You really need to go a little bit closer, and get to know them better. So there was that too, intercultural education. I've done a bit of work on taking Australian students to India to do a teaching round, to teach in an Indian school. They used to love that. One of the lovely things I have to say is that we have a young generation of teachers growing up. I'm sure here in New Zealand too, who have wonderful open minds, a lot more open than previous generations, and that's a really positive something to look forward to. I think a great openness and a great honesty. Young people are fed up of all this political claptrap. They want to hear the real thing, and tell us how it was, tell us how it is they keep asking. Yep.
I think that's maybe a better thing to end on. That's a nice positive
Sure.
note to end on.
Sure.
Before you go, you have heard the podcast, so you know that I will ask you a set of rapid fire questions, and I just want you to give answers as quickly as possible. So, Finn, now you have the choice of either being asked the questions as well, or you can be asking part of the questions.
I will be asking as well.
All right. If that's the case, let's get started.
Summer or winter?
Summer.
Movies or TV series?
Movies.
If your life were a movie or a series, what genre would it belong to?
Detective whodunit.
Oh, ancestry work is detective work in its own right. So
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Right. Morning, noon, or night?
Morning,
Outdoors or indoors?
indoors,
Cats or dogs?
India or Australia?
Australia.
Ooh. After 45 minutes on trying to find the Indian in you, you
I
say
vote for
Australia.
Australia.
It's Australia, mate.
Yeah.
Okay.
The cricket team is what sways me a bit.
Fair enough. There's a story here of my mom, of course. So my parents are from India.
Yeah.
They came over here,
Yeah.
and my mom was asked, "At what point of time will you start supporting New Zealand?" Because she said that she supports India, and and my mom was like, "The days my sons play for New Zealand, until then, I will be supporting India."
Lovely answer. I like that answer.
Yeah. What's your weapon of choice?
Bow and arrow.
Which superpower would you like to have?
Telling the past. Yes, look back with a clear picture.
What is your least favorite type of music?
Hip hop. Hop, hip.
Okay, I think we're about to have a problem up in here.
Well, yeah. Well, he said it now. If he'd said it at the start, this episode wouldn't have happened. What's your favorite food or cuisine?
Indian.
Oh, within Indian.
Within Indian.
Within Indian, which cuisine is your favorite one?
A good curry. In a hurry. Isn't that curry in a hurry? Is it?
Well, from what area?
Yeah.
Oh.
You're a Bengali person.
Bengali.
I assume so.
Yeah, I don't mind a Punjabi. Punjabi food is just beautiful.
Yeah, crack up. What is the ugliest fruit or vegetable?
Jackfruit.
Yeah, they are ugly.
Ugly. They are very ugly.
They smell bad as well.
Not as bad as the Malaysian, whatever they call it.
If you could be any animal, what would it be?
Buffalo. Lying in, shit. Just enjoying the slush,
Hey, yo!
sitting there.
Okay, what's
The
the worst
smile
thing
on
you've
their
paid
face.
money for?
Mobile phone?
Don't need it.
No.
If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
Probably Wellington.
Oh, what quote or saying do people say, but is complete bullshit?
If you try hard enough, it'll work.
Ooh.
Sometimes it just doesn't work.
It just doesn't work. And people are trying very hard and it just doesn't work.
All right. What is your version of there are two types of people in this world?
There are two types of people in this world, those who hope and those who pray.
What is something which is legal but feels illegal?
Marriage.
You think it feels illegal?
Oh, yeah. It's in fact, it could finish you off in jail. It could do all sorts of things to you. But it's supposed to be all right, but often isn't. It's a bit of a furphy that.
All right, if you weren't doing this, which we were saying research and as a lecturer, what would you be doing?
Being a buffalo.
Back to the buffalo.
Okay. What type of researcher is most likely to win a drinking contest, and why is it an education researcher?
Why is it?
Why is it?
They
Why is
wouldn't-
it you?
Oh, I wouldn't win the beer drinking competition. Who would win? Probably the accountant. Yeah, they'd work out how many drinks they can get free and how many they'd work. They'd work some deal out. Accountants.
They
Okay.
run the world, don't they?
Yeah.
Lastly, if you could give us one piece of advice to leave with, what would it be?
One piece of advice to leave with: don't look for pieces of advice.
Oh, you got some good wisdom.
Yeah.
Hit us with a gem.
Oh, connect the dots.
Yeah. That's a good
Avaz
one.
suno.
Oh, that's enough. All right.
Avaz suno is the best bit of advice.
Awesome.
Connect the dots.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Pa. What other names do you go for? Richard? What do I call you?
Trader to India.
Trader.
Now, talk about calling me.
Yeah.
I tell my students in their first lecture, there are two ways to fail this course. One is don't do anything, just don't hand anything in. And the other one is call me Dick. I said, if you call me Dick, I'll fail you.
All right, so I won't be cutting that.
Don't call me Dick, call me Pa, call me anything, don't call me Dick.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Pa, for coming on. Thanks so much, Finn, for joining as well.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Zahir. Thank you, Finn.
And thanks everyone for listening. Again, you can find us all of Dr. Richard Johnson's details will be in the description for our podcast. We'll also have the link to the Indian in Me on there so that if anybody's interested in his work or getting involved as well, any people who'd be interested in finding their Anglo-Indian heritage can hit you up.
Yep.
If that's okay.
Thank you.
And yeah, thanks guys. Until next time, connect the dots. Awasano. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.